I have been a translation officer for 19 years. I have decoded the drift cant of the Vithali reaches, the layered tonal script of the Davith collective, and the pressure form notation used by a species that had been extinct for 4,000 years, before the Accord cataloged their final archive. I say this not to establish expertise. I say it because it matters, later, that I am not someone who confuses the work with the feeling of the work. I understand the difference between a symbol and what it represents. I have always understood that difference. I no longer understand it in the same way. The document arrived in the standard intake queue, flagged low priority, classified as personal correspondence. The human vessel had been boarded and cleared by Accord Customs at the Vethara Transit node 11 days prior. Standard confiscation protocol sweeps personal written materials from vessels of species under active behavioral documentation. A category that includes humans has included humans for the 6 years since first contact and will include humans, I suspect, for some time. The letter had been routed to my queue because written human materials of personal origin are considered culturally low risk and are typically translated, summarized in 2 sentences, and archived. I had processed 41 such items in the previous quarter: cargo manifests, maintenance logs, 1 journal. None of them had required more than 3 hours. I opened the document at the start of my second shift on the 7th day of transit. The letter was handwritten, actual ink on actual paper, which is unusual enough among humans that it carries its own notation in their cultural index. I logged the format, adjusted my scan aperture for a physical document, and began. The first anomaly appeared at 11 minutes. My focus response index, which compliance monitoring tracks as a background passive function on all Accord personnel during active translation work, showed a 14% elevation above my resting baseline. I noted it, attributed it to the unfamiliar substrate. Ink on paper reads differently from requires more active visual processing, and continued. The letter was written in an older variant of the primary human trade language. The author was male. He was writing to a woman he had not yet met in person, which the cultural index flagged as unusual, which I recognized as a common human epistolary convention. He was describing her handwriting. He was describing the way her sentences accelerated near the end of each paragraph, how her punctuation became sparse when she was most certain of what she was saying. He wrote, "I have never heard your voice and I know exactly how it sounds when you are not afraid." At 22 minutes, compliance monitoring logged a second alert. My focus response index had reached 31% above baseline. My secondary affect register, which tracks emotional valence in the Davith range, closest neurochemical analog available for my species, had moved 9 points into positive territory. I had not felt it move. That is the phrase I used in my initial notation, and I want to be precise about what I meant. The register moved, and I did not experience the movement as a feeling. I experienced it afterward, the way you notice a door has been open because the temperature in the room has changed. I flagged the monitoring anomaly and continued translating. The human author was writing about certainty. He was writing about the specific sensation of recognizing something true before you have any evidence, and he was describing it not as philosophy, but as a physical event, as weight, as pressure, as a thing that occupied space inside him. His language was plain. He used no unusual structures, no rhetorical devices that my index could classify as persuasion mechanics. He was simply reporting an internal state with precision. That is all he was doing. Compliance Commander Reva's Duel arrived in the translation suite at 29 minutes. She had been watching the monitoring feed from the command corridor. When a senior translation officer's affect register shows a 17-point positive shift during active document work, the compliance protocol requires a supervisor to make visual contact. She came in quietly, stood behind my station, and looked at my screen. She looked at the document. She looked at the scan readout. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How much of it have you translated?" I told her. "Approximately 60%. The document was 4 pages, handwritten on both sides, dense in the margins. She called for a second linguist. Analyst Secondary Veth Saran arrived 18 minutes later. She had not been briefed on the nature of the document, only that a translation was required. She was given a clean monitoring profile, seated at the secondary station, provided the letter from the beginning, and asked to translate. Rivasdul and I watched the monitoring output together in silence. At 9 minutes, Soren's focus response index elevated 11%. 16 minutes, her affect register moved 8 points positive. At 22 minutes, she stopped translating and sat still for a moment. She did not appear distressed. She appeared to be listening to something, which is the only description I have for what I observed. Then she resumed. Duel pulled the document from the queue and filed a Class 2 escalation. Directorate Officer Keth Vorath arrived by relay at the next scheduled communication window. A delay of 6 hours, during which the document was sealed under standard hold protocol, and neither Soran nor I were permitted to access it. Vorath reviewed our monitoring records without comment. He reviewed the Accord's existing database of behavioral documentation on human subjects, specifically the subfile on human written materials, which, and this is the part I want to note clearly, contained no prior entries of this type. The file existed. It was empty. He asked me to describe the sensation of translating the document. I am a trained observer. I have precise vocabulary for neurochemical states. I told him that my affect register had moved, that I had not experienced the movement as it occurred, that I had become aware of it only when Duel alerted me. Told him that the document appeared to function as a delivery mechanism, that the emotional state the human author had been in at the time of writing seemed to be encoded in the language itself, not as subtext or implication, but as a direct transmission, and that translation did not decode the message into meaning, but transferred it into the reader intact. Vorath asked, "Did you want to finish it?" I told him yes. He did not ask a follow-up question. He looked at the monitoring data one more time, wrote 3 lines into his field log, and sealed the document for transfer to the Accord Research Archive on Station Deveth-Keth. That was the end of the official inquiry. I want to be clear about what the data shows. The monitoring record is unambiguous. A human personal document, written by one individual to another, produced measurable neurochemical effect in 2 separate Accord personnel with no prior exposure to the human subjects, no shared cultural context, and no voluntary emotional engagement with the material. The effect was not subliminal persuasion in any category the Accord has previously documented. It was not propaganda architecture, which we know how to identify. It was not chemical agent. The document was fully screened at intake. It was language. Ink on paper. Symbols arranged in sequence by a human male who, as far as the Accord's records indicate, had no training in neurological manipulation, no awareness of Accord physiology, and no possible knowledge that his letter would ever be read by anyone other than the woman he was writing to. The working hypothesis, Vorath's 3 lines do not quite commit to, but which the data supports, is this. Human written language does not merely encode meaning, it encodes state. The author's neurochemical condition at the time of composition is preserved in the structure of the language itself, in rhythm of the sentences, in the precision or imprecision of the word choices, in the places where the syntax accelerates or slows, and a sufficiently close reading transfers that state into the reader. Translation, rather than filtering the effect, appears to deepen it. The effort of decoding requires the linguist to inhabit the language more completely than a native reader would. You have to build the meaning from its components. And when you build it inside yourself. I do not know how to classify this in the Accord's existing framework. I have filed the monitoring data, the document scan, and this disclosure. I have noted that the Accord's behavioral documentation protocols for human written materials are currently calibrated to flag persuasion mechanics, encoded directives, and cryptographic content. They are not calibrated for this. I have recommended that the relevant section of the protocol be reviewed. What I have not filed is this. After Vorath sealed the document and the suite cleared, I retrieved the working translation from my secondary buffer, the 60% I had completed before the escalation. I sat at my station and I finished it. The letter ended the way I had expected it to end. The human author told the woman he was writing to that he did not know if the letter would reach her. He told her that he had written it anyway. He said that some things were worth putting into words, even if the words went nowhere, because the act of saying them precisely, of finding the exact shape of a true thing, was its own kind of arrival. I sat with that for a while. Then I filed this report.